Today we talk about the scariest part of IVF. And no, it's not the shots or the retrieval. It's something no one can predict. Fertilization.
I'm Dr. Mark Amols, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.
When going through IVF, there are many things to worry about. Whether you'll get enough eggs, whether you'll get enough embryos, whether those embryos will even come back genetically normal, or whether your transfer will work. There are so many things to worry about, it seems like it's countless. But there's actually only one thing that keeps me up at night, and that is fertilization. And it's not because it normally goes bad. It's because it's one of the most unpredictable parts of the entire IVF process. Almost every step of IVF can be predicted. When it comes to the egg number you're going to get, we can predict that. How many will be mature? Again, predicted. Once you have embryos that fertilized, we know by prediction about how many will become blastocysts. And once you get to blastocyst, we know how many will probably be genetically normal. We know the percentage of the transfer working. But the one thing we can never know is whether fertilization will work. No matter how good the sperm is, no matter how good the eggs are, there are times where the fertilization just goes wrong. To understand this, we need to go back to high school biology, IVF edition. This is where sperm meets egg and either magic happens or total silence. Now, if you listened to any of my prior podcasts, you've heard me talk about the concept that all the eggs you have are made in the womb. But what a lot of people don't understand is that those eggs undergo a process called meiosis. Again, that's different than mitosis, which is the normal division of cells. Meiosis is where there's the division to get to half the amount of DNA, so that way it can combine with a sperm, which also has half the DNA. But what's really interesting about eggs that's different than sperm is that eggs stop halfway in the first division of meiosis compared to sperm, which complete the full 2 meiosis stages. And so that means your eggs are stuck in that phase halfway through until the day you're going to ovulate that egg. Now, because meiosis has 2 stages, your eggs are arrested in the first phase of prophase, and we call that prophase 1. Now, when you're taking medication to cause your follicles to become mature, what we're talking about is we're getting the eggs ready. And then we give HCG to restart the process of meiosis, and that will carry it all the way to meiosis 2, metaphase. So that now becomes metaphase 2. At this point, the egg is just waiting. It's waiting for a sperm. If a sperm is present, then it will penetrate the zona pellucida, where then the egg will then complete meiosis 2 and inject what's called a second polar body. The polar body is the leftover cytoplasm and membrane when the cell divides unevenly, creating a bigger egg and a small polar body. At this point, the male and the female DNA form a pronucleus. This pronucleus can actually be seen when you look under a microscope. If we see 2 pronucleuses, then we know we have normal fertilization. Therefore, when the embryologist is going to look for fertilization, they look for a couple things. If they see 2 polar bodies, they know that the egg fertilized and now is an embryo. The next step then they look at is the pronucleus and find out if there's 2. And if there are, again, normal fertilization has occurred. What's interesting is that this fertilization doesn't occur right away, meaning the fertilization may occur, but when the embryologist needs to look for these pronuclears is during a certain window. And they time it to make sure that they can then see this fertilization. And so they could potentially miss it if they look too early or look too late. The pronuclei only show up for a period of time and then they disappear. Which means if you don't see the pronuclei, it doesn't mean it didn't fertilize. It just means that either it didn't fertilize or you missed the window. When the 2 p.m. fades, we call that a 2 p.m. fade because it disappeared before we got there. And so when you see a 0 pronuclei, called a 0 p.m., but you see 2 polar bodies, you know it fertilized, but you wonder, did it fertilize abnormal, or did we miss the window, such as a 2 p.m. fade? This is usually not a usable embryo if it doesn't start dividing. If it does divide, we know then we must have missed the window. Now another situation can be a 1 pronucleus. This is called a 1 p.m. This could be abnormal, where only male or only female DNA formed a pronucleus. This can also be parthenogenesis, where the egg activated without the sperm. We don't usually transfer these. However, if you are able to watch them and they make it a blastocyst, you can biopsy them and then test them to make sure that there is not a monoploidy embryo. Now, the gold standard, as we talked about, was the 2 p.m. This is 1 piece of DNA from the sperm and 1 from the egg. This tells us that fertilization occurred as we expected. Now, after that, you can have multiple PNs, 3 PN, 4 PN, 5 PN, and this could happen when either 2 sperm fertilize 1 egg, causing polyspermy, which can lead to polyploidy in the embryo. There's also the possibility that the egg could have an extra DNA in it and could have caused the increased PN number. These are typically discarded. If they are kept separately, and then what will happen is, with PGT testing, they can determine if it truly is a polyploidy embryo. So what does this actually mean? It means that even if you are told you had 100% fertilization, the question is, did they fertilize normal? If it's a 0 PN, a 1 PN, a 3 PN or greater, they're not always usable. Only 2 PNs are considered normal fertilization. Now, common sense would say, well, then let's do ICSI, because if we bypass nature and inject the sperm in directly, then nothing can go wrong. But that is not true. Even when you inject the sperm in, you might prevent polyspermy, but that doesn't mean you can't get polyploidy embryos because the egg could have extra DNA. You can also not have fertilization that can happen. And the other thing is the actual cell can die. So sometimes when you go to do ICSI, the cell itself can start leaking and it can die. Even the next day, the cell can undergo atresia. And that's because when older patients, sometimes the egg quality is poor and it dies after the ICSI. I've seen cases where there are fragile membranes where they stick the ICSI needle in and everything starts leaking out. Now, ICSI is great when you've had a history of failed fertilization, where you did conventional fertilization and none of the eggs fertilized. But it's important to understand it does not guarantee that you will get fertilization or even normal fertilization. There are some cases with conventional fertilization where you may fertilize 20 eggs and nothing fertilizes. We would call that a failed fertilization, and we would definitely recommend doing ICSI the next time. But there are times where you do fertilization and it's a partial failed fertilization, where maybe 3 of 20 eggs fertilize and the rest don't. And that's when it's important to look at the details then and say, well, did they fertilize and fertilize abnormal, such as 0 PNs, or did they not fertilize at all? It's also important to know how many eggs were mature. It's amazing when I talk to patients and they'll tell me, oh, I had 25 eggs, but only 12 fertilized. And then I look at the report and I realize, well, they only had 15 that were mature. So of course, only 12 fertilized. There was only 15 that could even fertilize. So sometimes it may look worse than it is. You can't look at the total number of your eggs. You have to look at the number of mature eggs. You can start with 1 million eggs. It doesn't mean anything if only 10 of them are mature. At that point, you have to limit your expectations to fewer number of embryos. So why does fertilization keep me up at night? It's because it doesn't matter if you're young. It doesn't matter if you're older. It doesn't matter if you've even had kids naturally without any help. When you do IVF, it's not natural. And sometimes some people don't do well when it comes at the fertilization stage. Things like egg quality and cytoplasmic maturity can completely change the results. Sperm can look great on every semen analysis, but on the day of, it might have been a bad game day. There are even very rare things like calcium signaling failure or issues with the acrosomal reaction that occurs between the sperm and the zona pellucida. The point is, it's not predictable. I have seen many cases where I expect everything to go well and it doesn't, and this is the stage that ends up shocking me. Now, when I see bad sperm, I'll prepare someone and say, hey, you know what? There's a very high chance there could be poor fertilization, maybe only 50% in your situation. And then they'll do amazing and get 100%. And I'm going, what the heck? And yet the person with perfect sperm, they'll have only 25% fertilization. Now, I think it's important to understand fertilization normally does go well. And statistically, as I've mentioned before, about 70-80% of the eggs end up getting fertilized. But the reason it scares me is because it's the one part that's not predictable. As I mentioned, if you have poor egg quality, we're going to expect fewer eggs. If we notice that the sperm is poor quality, we predict there may be lower fertilization. If we know you're older, we know we're not going to get as many genetically normal embryos. But the thing is, fertilization plays by its own rules. And for that reason, I can't predict it, and that's what scares me. Should you be scared? I would say yes. Not because it won't go good, but because good sperm does not guarantee fertilization. Young age doesn't mean you're bulletproof. This is the point where emotionally you can feel devastated when you go through everything and all of a sudden things don't fertilize and you feel like you've wasted an entire cycle. Now, the good thing is there are things we can do that sometimes help this. We can use things like the Zymod chip. We can use ICSI. We can use pixie dishes. There are many things we can do that help when we think there's going to be a problem. But that's the part that scares me, because sometimes when it looks like there's no issues at all, that's when tragedy can sometimes happen. The good news is, normally it goes fine for most people. So who are the people who are at the most risk for failed fertilization or poor fertilization? Obviously, this is going to be people who have poor sperm quality. That's going to potentially lead to poor fertilization. As women age, there is also some changes that occur, such as accumulation of spindle and chromosomal damage that can then lead to poor fertilization. Abnormal pronuclei, such as the 1PN or 3PN, and early degeneration or abnormal embryo development. Basically, the longer the egg has been stuck in prophase 1, the more likely something can go wrong. This is why we tend to see women who are more mature have lower ovarian reserve and poor outcomes. So overall, what's the takeaway? Fertilization is very complex. We're constantly looking for new ways to help improve it. Unfortunately, you cannot predict fertilization from the egg count, hormonal levels, or even the sperm quality. So that means even with 20 eggs, you may not have fertilization. It makes you feel better, but unfortunately, this is the one step that God is truly in charge of. In some ways, fertilization is the first true biological test of egg and sperm quality. Nothing is guaranteed until you see that 2PN. Now, the good news is, once you see that 2PN, we know the prediction of how many will become blastocysts and how many will come back genetically euploid. My goal is definitely not to scare you. My goal is just to let you know this is one of the areas I get worried about. Most people are worried about the number of eggs they get. They're worried about other parts of the IVF process. But this is the one that scares me because I know it's so unpredictable. I know that sometimes patients I would never expect to have poor fertilization can have very poor fertilization. And just like I've had people who have severely poor sperm end up having great fertilization. But the thing is, it doesn't matter if you have 100 eggs. If only 10 are mature, then the most you're probably going to get is somewhere around 10 embryos. And the same token, it doesn't matter if you start with 100 eggs and only 10 fertilize, then you're down to 10 embryos. So this is the point where there's the biggest drop for many people. May not be for you, but for many people it is, and that's why it can be scary. The good news is, as always, we can take that information, we can now adjust for your next cycle, and be able to give you the best chance. IVF doesn't always work on the first try, and should never give up if it doesn't. Remember, now we can see things and make adjustments, and hopefully help in the next cycle. I hope that you never went through this and had a bad fertilization experience, but if you did, hopefully this episode helped you, or maybe you're going to be going through IVF, and this may help you face some of the fears that may come ahead. If you know someone who maybe is interested in this type of topic, let them know that we did an episode on this. This may help them. And if you love our episodes, you love the show, as always, give us a 5-star review on your favorite medium. Tell your friends about it, tell your families about it, but most of all, keep coming back. If you have any suggestions for topics, send it to tbft@newdirectionfertility.com, and I'll be sure to add that into my list of topics. I look forward to talking again next week on Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.